I take the biggest risk today, and you are the only reason it does not feel like madness. You never knew how close I have been to this edge before, not once, not even on the nights when I stood on the balcony with the entire empire sleeping beneath me, wondering how much of it would collapse if I simply let go, and still I never stepped forward. Not until now. What you don't see is how carefully this moment has been built, how every silence, every restraint, every lie I told myself has led me here. This is not impulse. This is not desperation. This is decision sharpened into something irreversible. You are not here to hear it, and maybe that is why I can finally say it without hesitation. Because if you are standing in front of me, looking at me the way you do, seeing through everything I pretend to be, I might falter, and I cannot afford to falter now. They believe I am still under control. That is their first mistake. They believe I will always choose the crown over anything that threatens it. That is their second. And still they do not realize that the greatest threat to this crown has never come from enemies beyond these walls, but from something far quieter, far more dangerous. From you. From the way you made me question everything they taught me to protect. From the way you made me see that power without truth is nothing but a performance dressed in gold. I used to think that was strength. Now I know it is weakness disguised as tradition. So today I step outside of everything they built around me. Not loudly, not with spectacle, quietly, deliberately, in a way they will not understand until it is too late to stop. And still, even now, there is a question that refuses to leave me. What happens when a prince stops playing the role he was born into? What happens when he chooses something they cannot control? The answer begins with you. Do you remember the first time you refused to look away from me? You should, because I have never forgotten it. It was not defiance, not exactly. It was something more unsettling than that. Recognition. As if you saw something in me that I had spent my entire life hiding. Something I did not even know how to name yet. And still you held that gaze like it belonged to you. Like you were not standing in front of a prince, but a man who had not yet decided who he wanted to be. That was the moment everything began to shift, though I did not understand it then. What you don't see is how rare that was. How every person in this palace has been trained to lower their eyes, to soften their presence, to make themselves smaller in the presence of power. You did not. You stood exactly as you were, unafraid of what that might cost you. And it cost you everything. I watched it happen slowly at first, then all at once. The way the court began to notice you, the way your name moved through whispered conversations like something dangerous. You never belonged here, not in the way they require. You were never meant to bend, never meant to disappear into silk and silence the way they expected. And that is why I could not stay away from you. Because in a place where everything is controlled, everything is rehearsed, everything is predictable, you were the only thing that felt real. You touched my hand once, just once, and it was enough to undo years of discipline. Not because it was bold, but because it was unafraid. You did not hesitate. You did not ask. You simply acted as if the distance between us was something you refused to acknowledge. And in that moment, I realized something I have never been able to forget. You were not drawn to my power. You were indifferent to it. And that indifference, it became the most dangerous thing I have ever known. The court has already begun to know, even if they do not yet understand what I have done. That is how this place survives. It senses disruption before it sees it, reacts to shifts before they are spoken aloud. You would feel it instantly if you were here. The way conversations tighten, the way smiles hold just a second too long, the way silence starts to carry meaning instead of absence. What you don't see is how quickly love becomes a liability in a place like this. Not because it is weak, but because it cannot be controlled. And anything that cannot be controlled must be removed. That is where you exist now. Not as a memory, not as a secret, but as a problem they intend to solve. I have seen the way they look at me when they think I am not paying attention, measuring, calculating, waiting for proof that I have stepped out of line far enough to justify what they already want to do. And still they hesitate because I am not just a man to them. I am an heir, a symbol, a future they have invested too much in to discard lightly. So they will not strike at me first. They will strike at you. That is the truth they will never speak aloud, but it is the one I cannot ignore. Because you are the one variable they cannot predict, the one influence they cannot contain. And that makes you dangerous in ways you may not even realize. But here is what they have misunderstood. You are not my weakness. You are the reason I no longer have one. So tell me, if you were here, what would you ask of me? Would you tell me to stop, to choose safety over certainty, to remain within the boundaries that have kept me alive this long? You might. You always understood consequence better than I did. You always saw the ending before I was willing to acknowledge it. And still, even knowing that, I cannot turn back now. Because turning back would mean becoming something I no longer recognize. Something hollow, something that survives at the cost of everything that makes survival worth anything at all. This is where it becomes complicated. Not the decision itself, but what it demands afterward. Because risk is never just a moment. It is a chain, a sequence of consequences that unfolds long after the initial choice is made. And I have already stepped into that sequence. There is no stepping out again, only forward. You once told me that love is not proven in words, but in what you are willing to lose. I did not answer you then. I did not know how. Now I do. Now I understand that love, real love, is not gentle. It does not protect you from pain. It leads you directly into it, demands that you face it without hesitation, without illusion, without the comfort of pretending you have another option. And I do not have another option because losing you is no longer something I can survive. Not as a prince, not as a man. I take the biggest risk today, and it is no longer a choice. It is a path that has already begun to unfold beneath my feet, whether I am ready for it or not. You are somewhere beyond these walls, beyond the reach of everything that has tried to define me. And for the first time in my life, that distance does not feel like separation. It feels like direction, like something pulling me forward instead of holding me back. What you don't see is how close everything is to breaking. Not just the court, not just the fragile balance they have spent generations maintaining. Me, the version of me they created, is already gone. And what remains is something they will not recognize, something they cannot easily control, something that no longer measures itself by the standards they built. And still, there is one truth I cannot escape. If this fails, I lose everything. If this succeeds, I lose everything differently. So why do it? Why take a risk this large, this irreversible, this certain to change everything that comes after it? Because for the first time, I am not choosing between power and love. I am choosing between truth and survival. And I have finally understood something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Survival without you is not survival at all. I take the biggest risk today. A gold you can sit next to love. And no matter what it costs, I will not regret it. I take the biggest risk today, and the strangest part is how quiet it feels after the decision is made. Like the world itself is holding its breath, waiting to see if I truly understand what I have set in motion. And maybe I don't. Not completely. Not in the way a king is supposed to understand consequence before action. But I understand enough to know there is no returning to the version of myself that existed before this moment. You would see it immediately if you were here, the difference in the way I walk, the absence of hesitation that used to follow me like a shadow, because hesitation belonged to a man who still believed he had something to protect inside these walls. And that illusion is gone now. What you don't see is how carefully everything around me is beginning to shift, how the palace reacts not with chaos, but with precision, tightening in places I cannot yet see, adjusting in ways that will only become visible once it is too late to reverse them. They are watching, even now, even in silence, measuring how far I intend to go, waiting for the moment they can define this as rebellion instead of uncertainty. And still, I keep moving, not because I'm fearless, but because fear no longer has the power to stop me. Not when the alternative is a life where you remain just out of reach, just beyond every choice I make. You always believed I was capable of more than obedience. And I used to think that belief was dangerous, that it would lead me somewhere I was not prepared to survive. But now I see that it was the only honest thing anyone ever offered me. Because obedience is easy in a place like this, it is rewarded, it is protected, it is mistaken for strength, when in reality it is just the absence of resistance, and I have lived inside that absence for far too long. What you don't see is how quickly that changes once you step outside it, how every movement becomes deliberate, every silence becomes meaningful, every glance becomes something you have to read instead of ignore. The court has begun to understand that something is wrong, not fully, not clearly, but enough to make them uneasy, enough to make them watch me in ways they never have before, and still they do not act because they are waiting for certainty, waiting for proof that I have crossed the line they cannot allow me to return from. They do not realize that line is already behind me, that the moment I chose you over everything they built, I stepped into something they no longer have the power to contain. And that is what makes this dangerous, not just for me, but for anyone who stands too close to the consequences. There is something else you should know, something I have not said even in the quietest parts of my own mind, because acknowledging it changes the shape of everything that follows. This was never just about leaving, never just about choosing you over the life I was given. It is about what comes after that choice, about the reality that forms when there is no longer a structure to return to, no safety in titles, no protection in tradition. What you don't see is how exposed that makes me, how every decision from this point forward belongs entirely to me, without the shield of expectation to hide behind. And that should terrify me more than it does, but instead it feels like something else, something sharper, something clearer, something that refuses to be ignored, because for the first time, I am not acting as a prince trying to preserve a future that was never truly mine. I am acting as a man who has decided that whatever comes next will be built on something real, even if that reality is unstable, even if it threatens to collapse under the weight of everything I have abandoned. And still I move toward it, because the alternative is no longer something I am willing to consider. They will come for you not because they hate you, but because they understand exactly what you represent. And that understanding makes you more dangerous than any enemy they have ever faced. You are not power in the way they recognize. You do not command armies or influence alliances, but you have done something far more disruptive. You have changed me in a way they cannot reverse, and that is something they cannot allow to exist unchecked. What you don't see is how carefully they will approach this, how they will avoid direct confrontation, how they will attempt to reshape the situation in ways that make resistance seem unnecessary, even unreasonable. They will offer distance, safety, silence, anything that removes you from my reach without forcing a conflict they are not yet ready to face. And you might consider it, not for yourself, but for me, because you have always carried that kind of quiet strength, that willingness to step back if it means protecting something greater. But this is where you must not do that. This is where you must understand that stepping away does not protect me. It destroys the very thing I've chosen to fight for. Because what I am building now, what I am risking everything to create, cannot exist without you at the center of it. I take the biggest risk today, and I can feel the weight of it settling into something permanent, something that will not fade or soften with time, something that will define everything that follows, whether I succeed or fail. You are no longer just a memory, no longer just a possibility that exists somewhere beyond my reach. You are the direction I am moving in, the point everything is converging toward, the one certainty in a world that has begun to unravel in ways I cannot fully predict. What you don't see is how close I am now to leaving all of this behind, not just in words or intention, but in action, in movement, in a decision that will place me beyond the control of everything I have ever known. And still I do not hesitate, because hesitation belongs to a life I have already abandoned. If I lose everything, then I lose it knowing I chose something real. If I gain nothing, then I gain it without regret. And if I reach you, if I finally stand in the same place as you without distance, without silence, without everything that has tried to keep us apart, then this risk will not feel like risk at all. It will feel like inevitability, because some choices are not meant to be weighed. They are meant to be taken. I take the biggest risk today, and tonight I feel the first real consequence of it. Not in the form of punishment, not yet, but in the way the palace has begun to close around me like something alive, something aware, something that senses it is losing control and is adjusting itself to compensate. You would notice it instantly, the difference in the air, the way silence feels heavier, the way footsteps echo longer than they should, as if every movement is being recorded somewhere beyond sight. What you don't see is how deliberate this is, how nothing here happens without intention, how even stillness is a form of action when it is used correctly. They are not confronting me because confrontation would give me something to push against, something to resist, something to define myself in opposition to, and they are too careful for that. Instead, they are waiting, letting the weight of my own decision settle, letting it grow heavier with each passing moment until it either breaks me or forces me to retreat. And still, they misunderstand something fundamental. They think weight creates weakness. They think pressure forces collapse. But what they fail to see is that some structures do not break under pressure. They harden. They become something else entirely, something that no longer responds the way it once did. And that is what I am becoming now, not because I want to, but because there is no other way to survive what I have already chosen. You once asked me what I feared most, and I gave you an answer that sounded convincing enough to satisfy the moment. Something about failure, about dishonor, about losing the crown I was raised to inherit. But none of that was ever true, not in the way fear needs to be true to matter. The truth is quieter, more difficult to admit because it has nothing to do with power or position and everything to do with something far more fragile. I feared becoming someone who could live without you, not feel the absence. What you don't see is how close I came to that version of myself, how easily I could have stepped into a life where you became a distant memory, something softened by time, something that no longer held the weight it once did. And that possibility terrified me more than any loss of power ever could, because it meant losing the only thing that ever made me feel real. Now that fear is gone, not because it no longer matters, but because it is no longer possible. I cannot become that man anymore. That version of me no longer exists. and in its place is something that feels both stronger and more dangerous, something that has accepted the cost of what it wants and is no longer searching for ways to avoid paying it. There are moments, brief and sharp, where I realize just how far this has already gone. Moments where I catch myself thinking not like a prince navigating expectation, but like something else entirely, something that operates outside the boundaries I was trained to respect. It happens in small ways at first, in the way I observe the gods instead of trusting them, in the way I read expressions instead of accepting them, in the way I begin to anticipate movement instead of reacting to it. What you don't see is how quickly that shift becomes permanent. How once you start seeing the structure from the outside, it becomes impossible to return to the illusion of being safely inside it. And that is where I am now. Not fully outside, not yet free, but no longer contained in the way they believe. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous, not just for me, but for everything connected to me. Because once a system begins to lose its hold on something it was designed to control, it does not simply let it go. It tightens, it adapts, it escalates. And I can feel that escalation coming, not as a sudden strike, but as something slower, more calculated, something that builds until resistance becomes unavoidable. And when that moment arrives, there will be no space left for hesitation. I have begun to understand something I was never meant to understand, something that changes the meaning of everything that has happened so far. This was never just about power, not in the way I was taught to see it. Power here is not the crown, not the throne, not the visible symbols they place above everything else. It is control over narrative, over perception, over what is allowed to be seen and what is forced into silence. And what you have done, without even trying, is disrupt that narrative in a way they cannot easily repair. You made me visible to myself, and that is something this place was never designed to allow. What you don't see is how threatening that is, how dangerous it becomes when someone inside the system begins to question not just the rules but the purpose behind them. Because once that question is asked, truly asked, it cannot be unasked. It lingers, it grows, it spreads, and that is what they fear. Not just what I have done, but what it might lead to if it is not contained quickly enough. And that is why this cannot remain quiet for much longer. Something will happen. Something that forces everything into the open. Something that demands a response that cannot be delayed or softened. It's like the biggest risk today, and now I understand that it was never just about the moment of choosing. It was about everything that follows, everything that unfolds once the choice has been made and cannot be undone. You are somewhere beyond all of this, untouched for now, but not unreachable, not beyond the consequences that are beginning to gather here like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. What you don't see is how close I am to stepping fully into that storm, how little remains between intention and action, how thin the line has become between what I am and what I am about to become. And still, there is no hesitation left in me, no part of me searching for a way back, no voice asking whether this is too much, too dangerous, too irreversible. Because I already know the answer to all of those questions, and it does not change anything. If this ends in ruin, then it ends in ruin. If it ends in loss, then I will carry that loss knowing I chose it. But if it leads me to you, if it closes the distance that has defined everything up until now, then every risk, every consequence, every fracture in the world I am leaving behind will mean something. I take the biggest risk today, and for the first time, I am not afraid of what comes after. I take the biggest risk today, and now the night itself feels like it belongs to that decision, as if even the shadows have shifted to watch what I will become next. You would sense it immediately, the way stillness carries intention here, the way silence is never empty but waiting, always waiting. What you don't see is how every step I take now feels measured against something unseen, like I am being weighed, evaluated, not just by the court, not just by the men who think they understand power, but by the very structure I am trying to leave behind. And still I do not slow down, because slowing down is how doubt finds its way back in, and doubt is something I have already chosen to abandon. There was a time when I would have questioned every move, calculated every outcome, tried to preserve something of what I was supposed to be. That time is gone. Now there is only forward, only movement, only the quiet certainty that whatever I am becoming, it cannot exist within these walls any longer. You once told me that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are in control. And I see that truth everywhere now. In the way the court carries itself, in the way confidence turns to subtle urgency when something does not follow the expected pattern. What you don't see is how fragile that control really is, how quickly it begins to fracture when confronted with something it cannot predict. I have become that fracture, not by force, not by declaration, but by refusal, by stepping outside the role they assigned me and continuing forward as if their expectations no longer apply. And that is what unsettles them the most, not what I have done, but what I am no longer doing. I am no longer obeying, I am no longer reacting, I am no longer seeking approval from a system that was never designed to understand me. And in that absence, something else has taken its place, something quieter but far more dangerous, something that does not need permission to act. There is a point in every transformation where the past stops feeling like something you can return to and starts feeling like something that belongs to someone else entirely. And I have reached that point now. What you don't see is how complete that separation feels, how distant a version of me who once stood comfortably within these halls has become, as if he never truly existed beyond the expectations placed upon him. I remember his thoughts, his fears, his careful obedience, but I do not feel them anymore. In their place is something sharper, something more defined, something that understands consequence not as something to avoid, but as something to accept. Because every step I take now carries consequence, every choice reshapes what comes next, and there is no longer any illusion that I can escape that. And still I move forward, because stopping would mean denying everything that has already changed, and that is something I cannot do, not after everything that has led me here. They are closer now. I can feel it, not in obvious ways, not in open confrontation or direct command, but in the tightening of space, in the way options begin to narrow without ever being visibly removed. What you don't see is how carefully that is done, how control is maintained not through force but through limitation, through the gradual closing of paths until only one remains, the one they want you to take. And for a moment I almost admire it, the precision, the patience, the understanding of human nature that allows them to shape decisions without ever appearing to do so. But admiration does not change anything, because I see it now. I recognize the pattern. And once you see it, once you understand it, it loses its power. They can close every path they want, they can narrow every option, it will not matter. Because the path I have chosen was never one they accounted for, never one they believed I would take, never one they know how to control. I take the biggest risk today, and now I understand that it was never just one risk, never just one moment, but a series of choices that continue long after the first step is taken. You are still ahead of me, still beyond reach, but no longer distant in the way you once were. Now you feel inevitable, like something I am already moving toward with a certainty that cannot be undone. What you don't see is how close everything is to breaking open, how near this all is to becoming something that can no longer be contained or hidden or softened into something acceptable. And when that happens, when everything is finally exposed, there will be no space left for hesitation, no room for retreat, no version of this where I step back into the life I have already left behind. And still, I do not fear that moment. Because whatever comes next, whatever this risk becomes once it fully reveals itself, it will lead me to you. And that has become the only outcome that matters. I take the biggest risk today. Now the edges of everything have begun to sharpen, as if the world itself is no longer willing to let me move through it without consequence. As if every step I take must now leave a mark that cannot be erased. You would feel it in the air, that subtle shift where possibility turns into inevitability, where choices stop feeling open and start feeling like they are narrowing towards something that has already decided its outcome. What you don't see is how alone this part of the journey becomes, how even in a palace filled with voices and movement, there is a silence that belongs only to me, a silence shaped by decisions no one else can share or undo. And still, that loneliness does not weaken me the way it once might have, because it is no longer empty. It is filled with direction, with purpose, with the quiet certainty that every step forward is taking me closer to something that matters more than anything I have left behind. There was a time when I believed risk meant uncertainty, meant stepping into something unknown without understanding what waited on the other side. But now I see it differently. Now I understand that the greatest risks are the ones where the outcome is clear and you choose it anyway. What you don't see is how certain I have become. Not about success, not about survival, but about you, about the fact that everything I am doing, everything I am risking leads back to you in a way that cannot be redirected or undone. That certainty should feel like a burden, like something heavy enough to slow me down, but instead it feels like the opposite, like something that removes hesitation entirely, like something that makes every decision simpler, sharper, more direct. Because when there is only one outcome that matters, everything else becomes irrelevant. I've started to notice the cracks more clearly now, not just in the court, not just in the system that raised me, but in the very idea of what this life was supposed to be. What you don't see is how fragile it all is once you stop believing in it. How quickly something that once felt immovable begins to reveal its weaknesses, its contradictions, its reliance on obedience rather than truth. And I am no longer obedient. That is the simplest way to say it, the most direct, the most dangerous. Because obedience was the foundation of everything here, the unspoken agreement that allowed power to function without constant resistance. And now that agreement is broken, not loudly, not violently, but completely. And once something like that breaks, it does not repair itself easily. You are closer than you realize. I can feel it now, not in distance, but in direction, in the way everything I do seems to narrow toward you, in the way every path that once felt uncertain now leads somewhere definite, somewhere real. What you don't see is how much of this has already been decided, how many pieces are already in motion, how little remains between intention and action. And still, there is a part of me that wonders what you will say when you finally understand the full weight of what I have done, what I have risked, what I have chosen without asking you if you were ready to be part of it. Because this was never just my decision. It became yours the moment I refused to let you remain outside of it. I take the biggest risk today. And now I understand that it was never about the risk itself. It was about what I was willing to become in order to take it. You are no longer a question in my life, no longer something I might choose if the world allowed it. You are the answer that reshaped every question I used to ask. What you don't see is how final that feels, how complete, how irreversible. Because there is no version of this where I turn back, no version where I pretend this never happened, no version where I return to the life that existed before you changed everything. And whatever comes next, whatever this risk becomes once it reaches its end, I will face it the same way I began it, without hesitation, without regret, without looking for another path, because there isn't one. There never was. I take the biggest risks today. And now I can feel the moment approaching, where everything stops being controlled and starts becoming real, where plans dissolve into action and action cannot be undone. You would recognize this feeling, the way the air tightens before something irreversible happens, the way instinct begins to speak louder than reason, not out of panic, but out of clarity. What you don't see is how close I am to that threshold, how little remains between where I stand now and the point where everything shifts beyond recovery. There is no more preparation left, no more time to adjust or reconsider, only the quiet understanding that whatever happens next will define everything that follows. And still, I do not hesitate, because hesitation belongs to uncertainty, and I am no longer uncertain about anything that matters. You are at the center of this, whether you realize it or not, whether you wanted it or not, whether you would have chosen it if I had given you the chance. What you don't see is how deeply you have already changed the course of things, how a single presence, a single refusal to disappear has set something into motion that cannot be easily contained. This was never about influence in the way the court understands it, never about power in the form they respect. It was about something quieter, something more disruptive, something that does not announce itself but reshapes everything around it simply by existing. And that is what you have done. That is what I am responding to now. Not just with words, not just with intention, but with action that carries consequence far beyond anything either of us can fully control. There is a moment in every decision where it stops belonging to you and starts belonging to the world, where the consequences extend beyond intention and begin to affect everything connected to it. I have reached that moment now. What you don't see is how wide the impact has already spread, how many unseen threads have begun to pull in response to what I have done, how many outcomes are already forming beyond my reach. And still, that does not weaken my resolve, because this was never about controlling the outcome. It was about choosing the path regardless of where it leads. And I have chosen completely, without reserve, without illusion. If you were here, you would ask me if I am ready, not for the risk itself, but for what comes after it, for the reality that follows, once everything has been set in motion and cannot be recalled. And I would not answer you immediately, not because I do not know, but because the answer is not simple, not something that fits into certainty or doubt. What you don't see is that readiness is no longer the question. Necessity is. This is no longer something I am preparing for. It is something I am already inside. Something that is unfolding whether I feel ready or not. And the only choice left is how I meet it. I take the biggest risk today, and now I understand that it was never about the moment of taking it. It was about everything that follows, everything that continues long after the first step is taken. You are no longer distant, no longer unreachable, no longer something that exists only in thought or memory. You are the direction of everything now, the point where all of this is leading, the reason this risk exists at all. What you don't see is how final that makes everything else, how completely it removes the possibility of turning back, of choosing differently, of pretending this was ever anything less than inevitable. And whatever happens next, whatever this risk becomes once it fully unfolds, I will meet it without regret, because it leads to you, and that has become the only outcome that matters. I take the biggest risk today, and now even time feels different, as if it has stopped moving forward in the way it used to, and has begun closing in around this moment, tightening, compressing everything into something immediate and unavoidable. You would feel it too, the way seconds start to carry weight, the way each breath seems to matter more than it should, as if the world is narrowing itself down to a single point where everything must converge. What you don't see is how clear everything has become inside that narrowing, how distractions fall away, how doubt loses its voice, how even fear begins to feel irrelevant in the presence of something larger, something that cannot be ignored or delayed any longer. And still, there is a strange calm in it, not the calm of safety, but the calm of certainty, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to question, nothing left to reconsider, nothing left but to step fully into what has already begun. There was always a version of this story where I chose differently, where I remained within the boundaries set for me, where I allowed time and distance to turn you into something softer, something less immediate, something I could carry without it changing the course of my life. What you don't see is how close that version came to becoming real, how easily I could have stepped into it, how convincingly I could have lived it without anyone ever knowing what had been lost in the process. But that version required something I no longer possess. It required me to forget you. And forgetting you was never something I was capable of, not truly, not in the way that would have made that life possible. So that path no longer exists. It has collapsed behind me, leaving only this one, this narrow, unforgiving, undeniable path that leads forward and nowhere else. You are closer now, I can feel it, not in distance, but in inevitability, in the way everything seems to align toward a single outcome, in the way the world itself feels like it is rearranging around the direction I have chosen. What you don't see is how much of this is already beyond my control. How many forces have already been set into motion that I cannot stop even if I wanted to. How much of what happens next will unfold regardless of my intentions. And still, that does not frighten me the way it should, because Control was never the point, not in the way I once believed. The point was always the choice, the act of stepping forward despite everything that might follow, despite everything that cannot be predicted or contained. If this ends the way they expect, if this risk collapses under the weight of everything that stands against it, then I will still know that I did not hesitate when it mattered, that I did not allow fear to dictate the shape of my life, that I did not choose safety over truth. What you don't see is how important that has become to me, not as a matter of pride, not as a matter of legacy, but as something quieter, something more personal, something that defines who I am when everything else is stripped away. Because titles can be taken, power can be removed, history can be rewritten, but the choices we make in moments like this remain shaping us in ways nothing else can. I take the biggest risk today, and now I see it for what it truly is. Not just a decision, not just a turning point, but a transformation that has already begun and cannot be undone. You are not just the reason for this anymore. You are the destination, the meaning, the answer to something I have been searching for long before I knew how to name it. What you don't see is how complete that feels, how absolute, how final. Because there is no version of this where I turn back, no version where I become who I was before, no version where this risk does not define everything that follows. And whatever comes next, whatever the cost, whatever the consequence, I will face it the same way I began, with you at the center of it all, with nothing left between us but the distance I am already